Hey everyone, welcome back. So today I want to talk with you about something that's been popping up a lot lately in the news, in comments, and honestly, in a lot of worry conversations I've been having with people in my own life. It's this idea of a $2,000 stimulus style payment tied to tariffs, sometimes called a tariff refund or a tariff rebate that President Donald Trump has been talking about, able to issue at least a $2,000 dividend and also pay down debt for the country. But we do a $2,000 dividend to the people of our country would probably set a limit of, income limit where it made sense. But we will be able to make a very substantial dividend to the people of our country. I believe we can do that without Congress. And I know right away that raises a lot of questions. Is it real? Who would get it? Where would the money come from? And most importantly, should you actually expect this money to show up in your bank account? Because for a lot of people right now, even the possibility of $2,000 feels meaningful. Groceries are still expensive, rent is still high, and yeah, a little extra breathing room matters. Understanding what's really going on here can help you plan, and just as importantly, help you avoid getting your hopes up in the wrong way. This isn't about politics, it's about being realistic and informed so you can make smart decisions with your money. Because at the end of the day, whether this check materializes or not, you still have bills to pay and a life to live. Before we go any further, though, let me ask you something real quick. When you hear about a possible stimulus-style check, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you? Relief, skepticism, confusion, or maybe just frustration? Let me know in the comments. I really do read them, and they help shape these conversations. Your perspective matters, and hearing what's on people's minds helps me understand what questions need answering. So let's talk about where this whole idea comes from. President Trump has been arguing that tariffs, which are basically taxes placed on imported goods, are bringing in so much money that the government could afford to send some of it back to Americans directly. He's used phrases like dividend and refund, and the number that keeps coming up is $2,000 per person. The basic message is tariffs are generating revenue, and Americans should see some of that money come back to them in the form of a check. The concept has been mentioned in multiple interviews, press conferences, and social media posts. It's been presented as a way to give Americans back some of what they've been paying through higher prices, essentially framing it as returning money that's rightfully theirs. Now, on the surface, that sounds pretty straightforward and honestly appealing. You pay higher prices because of tariffs, and then later you get a check that helps offset that cost. And guess what? That framing is not accidental. It's designed to connect with something very real that people are feeling right now, which is that prices went up fast and they never really came back down. We all remember what it was like before the pandemic. Then suddenly everything got more expensive. Supply chains broke down, inflation kicked in, and whether it was eggs, gas, cars, or rent, the sticker shock was real. And even now, years later, those prices haven't dropped back to where they were, so the promise of a refund feels like fairness, like balance being restored. It taps into a sense that people deserve to be made whole after years of financial pressure. But here's where things start to get more complicated, and this is the part I want to slow down on because it really matters. First, let's talk about the money itself. Tariffs do bring in revenue. That part is true. Last year, tariff collections were around $95 billion, and projections this year are higher, maybe $300 to $350 billion, depending on which new tariffs go into effect and how trade patterns shift in response. That sounds like a lot of money, and it is. It's a substantial increase compared to previous years. But when you zoom out, a universal $2,000 payment to Americans would cost somewhere around $600 billion. And that's just for one round. To put that in perspective, there are roughly 300 million people in the United States. If you're sending $2,000 to every adult or even to every household, the numbers add up incredibly fast. So even in a strong tariff year, the math doesn't quite line up. The government would be paying out far more than it brings in from tariffs alone. Now, you might say, well, the government has other revenue sources, right? And yes, that's true. Income taxes, corporate taxes, and other sources bring in trillions of dollars each year. But those funds are already allocated to existing programs like Social Security, Medicare, defense, and countless other obligations. And if this were to become something recurring like an annual payment, The cost over time could run into the trillions. That's where budget experts really start to push back because the federal government is already dealing with large deficits. We're talking about annual deficits in the range of $1 to $2 trillion, meaning the government spends far more than it collects each year. Adding another massive spending program without a clear funding source raises red flags for economists across the political spectrum. The Congressional Budget Office and other nonpartisan analysts have pointed out that creating new entitlements or direct payment programs without offsetting cuts or new revenue creates long-term fiscal risks. It's not just about 1 year. It's about setting a precedent and creating expectations that become difficult to walk back. Another thing to consider is who actually pays tariffs in the first place. There's a lot of debate about this, and it gets misunderstood all the time. While tariffs are technically charged on foreign goods and collected from importers, most economists agree that the cost is largely passed on to consumers here in the United States through higher prices. Here's how it works in practice. A company imports goods from China, let's say clothing or electronics. The tariff is charged when those goods enter the United States. The importing company pays that tariff to the U.S. government. But then what happens? That company typically raises the price of the product to cover the cost of the tariff, plus maybe a little extra to maintain their profit margins. So ultimately, you, the consumer, end up paying for it when you buy that product at the store. In fact, some estimates suggest that the average U.S. household is paying a little over $2,000 more per year because of tariffs. And yeah, that number should sound familiar. Various economic studies, including those from the Tax Foundation and the National Bureau of Economic Research, have tried to quantify the impact of recent tariff increases on household budgets, and that $2,000 figure keeps showing up. So in that sense, critics argue that this proposed check isn't really free money or a bonus. It's more like a partial refund of money families already paid at the store. You paid more for appliances, clothes, food, and other goods, and then later you might get a check that roughly matches that increase. That doesn't mean it wouldn't help, especially if the money arrives all at once rather than being spread out over a year of small price increases, but it does change how you think about it. If you're getting back money that you already spent, it's not the same as getting new money. It's more like breaking even, assuming the check amount actually matches what you paid in higher prices. And for some households, depending on their spending patterns, they might have paid more than $2,000 in tariff-related costs. For others, maybe less. It varies widely. Now let's talk about timing, because this is another area where things get fuzzy. President Trump has given different timelines at different points. At one point, he suggested checks could arrive in the middle of the year, perhaps around summer 2025. Later, he shifted that to toward the end of the year, suggesting maybe fall or winter. And in some interviews, when pressed for details, he seemed less certain, even questioning whether he had made firm promises at all. In one exchange, when asked specifically about the timeline, the response was more vague, focusing on the concept rather than concrete dates. Now, that kind of shifting timeline is important to notice, not because it means bad intent, but because it tells us this idea is still very fluid. It's in the discussion phase, the proposal phase, not the implementation phase. There's no finalized plan, no official program, no application process, no eligibility rules. Right now, it's a proposal, not a policy, and that distinction matters enormously. We've seen many proposals over the years that sounded promising, but never made it through the full legislative and administrative process needed to become reality. Think about it this way. When the pandemic stimulus checks went out, there was actual legislation passed by Congress, signed into law with specific dollar amounts, eligibility criteria, income limits, and timelines. The IRS had clear instructions on how to distribute the money. None of that exists yet for this tariff refund idea. And that brings us to one of the biggest obstacles, which is Congress. The president has suggested at times that congressional approval might not be necessary, but legal experts are pretty clear on this point. Only Congress has the authority to authorize spending and issue direct payments like this. That's not a gray area. It's written directly into how our government works, specifically Article 1 of the Constitution, which grants the power of the purse to Congress. Even people within the administration have acknowledged this reality. Any check like this would almost certainly require legislation, and that means debate, negotiation, and potentially significant changes to the original idea. It means committee hearings, amendments, votes in both the House and Senate, and all the compromises that come with that process. We've already seen related proposals stall. A previous bill for smaller payments didn't make it out of committee, meaning it never even got to a full vote. And another proposal focused on tax deductions instead of checks altogether, which is a very different thing. A tax deduction reduces your taxable income, which might save you a few $100s depending on your tax bracket, but it's nowhere near the same as getting a $2,000 check in the mail. So, even if the idea has support in principle, even if polls show that Americans like the concept, turning it into an actual payment is a long road. It requires alignment between the executive branch and Congress, agreement on funding mechanisms, and passage through multiple legislative hurdles. Each of those steps represents a point where the proposal could be modified, delayed, or stopped entirely. On top of all that, there's a major legal issue hanging over the entire tariff system itself. Some of the tariffs funding this proposal are being challenged in court. Multiple lawsuits have been filed arguing that the tariffs were imposed without proper congressional authorization or that they violate existing trade agreements. The Supreme Court has not yet issued a final ruling on these challenges. And until it does, there's uncertainty about whether these tariffs will remain in place. If they're struck down, the government could owe massive refunds to companies that paid them. We're talking potentially tens of billions of dollars that would have to be returned to importers who paid tariffs that were later deemed unlawful. And now here's where it gets interesting and a little frustrating. Even if companies do get refunds, that doesn't mean consumers see immediate relief. Businesses may use that money first to cover past losses or stabilize operations. They might invest it, save it, or use it to pay down debt. Price reductions at the store, if they happen at all, could take a long time. So the idea that tariff refunds automatically translate into lower prices or fast consumer checks just isn't how it works in practice. Markets don't adjust that quickly, and businesses don't typically pass savings on to consumers as fast as they pass costs on. It's an asymmetry that's been documented in economic research for decades. This uncertainty shows up in prediction markets too. When people are asked to bet on whether these payments will actually happen, the odds are relatively low, especially in the near term. Prediction markets, where people wager real money on political and economic outcomes, are currently pricing the probability of $2,000 checks going out in 2025 at somewhere between 20 and 35%, depending on the platform. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but it does suggest skepticism from people who follow policy closely and are willing to put money behind their predictions. These aren't just random guesses. They're informed assessments from individuals who study policy outcomes for a living. Now, I want to pause here and say something important. None of this means the idea is meaningless or that people are wrong to care about it. The reason this conversation exists at all is because financial pressure is real. People are stretched. Savings are down. According to recent data from the Federal Reserve, nearly 40% of Americans would struggle to cover a $400 emergency expense. Credit card debt is at record highs. Fixed incomes haven't kept up with costs. So when leaders talk about direct payments, it resonates. It speaks to genuine need and genuine frustration. People want relief. They want to feel like the economic system is working for them, not just against them. And that's valid, that's human, that matters. Supporters of the administration argue that tariffs are part of a bigger strategy to protect domestic industries and strengthen trade negotiations. From that perspective, the rebate discussion is about sharing the benefits of that strategy with the public. The idea is that by using tariffs to level the playing field with countries that have been taking advantage of the U.S. in trade, we create jobs, boost manufacturing, and ultimately generate wealth that can be distributed back to Americans. That's the optimistic view. It sees the tariff refund as a symbol of a government that's fighting for ordinary people, that's willing to take bold action to redistribute economic gains more fairly. Critics, on the other hand, see it more as messaging than a concrete plan. something that sounds good but may never fully materialize. They point to the lack of legislative text, the absence of a detailed funding mechanism, and the history of similar proposals that fizzled out. They worry that it's being used to build political support without the hard work of actually delivering the policy. And honestly, both perspectives can exist at the same time. You can acknowledge the intent while still being realistic about the hurdles. You can appreciate that leaders are talking about helping people financially while also recognizing that talk is different from action. You can hope for the best while preparing for other outcomes. So, what does this mean for you practically speaking? First, I wouldn't plan your budget around receiving this money. There is no official check, no timeline, and no guarantee. If it happens, great. That's a bonus. But relying on it could put you in a tough spot. Imagine if you delayed paying off debt or skipped building your emergency fund because you were counting on this $2,000 and then it never shows up. That would leave you worse off than if you just planned without it. Second, this is a good reminder to focus on what you can control. If prices are higher because of tariffs or inflation more broadly, small adjustments matter. Tracking expenses can help you see where your money is actually going. You might be surprised at how much is slipping through the cracks in subscriptions you don't use, convenience purchases, or impulse spending. Comparing prices across stores or using apps that help you find deals can save meaningful amounts over time. Even just being more intentional about meal planning to reduce food waste can put extra money back in your pocket each month. Building even a modest emergency fund, maybe starting with $500 or $1,000, can provide more stability than waiting on a policy outcome that may or may not arrive. Having that cushion means you're not as vulnerable to unexpected expenses or disruptions. It means you have options. And options create peace of mind in a way that waiting for government action never can. And third, stay informed, but try not to let every headline drive your emotions. Economic policy takes time, and it often looks very different at the end than it did in the early talking stages. What starts as a $2,000 universal check might become a $500 payment with income limits, or it might become a tax credit, or it might not happen at all. That's not cynicism. That's just how policy works. It goes through filters, it gets negotiated, compromises are made, and what emerges, if anything, is usually a modified version of the original idea. Understanding that process can help you maintain perspective and not get whipsawed by every new statement or tweet. As we keep watching how this unfolds, I'll continue to update you with what's actually changing, not just what's being said, because clarity matters, especially when money is involved. I'm not here to tell you what to think politically. I'm here to give you the facts, the context, and the practical implications so you can make informed decisions for yourself and your family. The reality is that big economic proposals like this are complicated. They involve trade-offs, legal constraints, political negotiations, and economic realities that don't always align with the initial vision. That doesn't make the vision wrong. It just makes it incomplete until all those other pieces fall into place. And sometimes they do fall into place. Sometimes proposals become law. Sometimes checks do go out. The pandemic relief payments proved that direct payments are possible when there's sufficient political will and urgency. But it also showed how much coordination and legislative action it takes to make it happen. The big takeaway here is that the $2,000 tariff refund check is an idea with real political momentum, but also real legal and financial barriers. It speaks to real economic stress, but it's far from guaranteed. It's worth paying attention to, but not worth counting on. It's worth hoping for, but not worth planning around. Your financial security is too important to leave up to political promises that may or may not materialize. So while we watch this story develop, while we track the legislation and the court cases and the statements from officials, I want you to focus on building your own financial stability. Because whether this check comes or not, you'll be better off having taken control of what you can control. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss updates as this story develops. And if you found this breakdown helpful, let me know in the comments. What questions do you still have? What would you do with $2,000 if it did arrive? And what are you doing now to improve your financial situation regardless of what the government does? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Stay informed, stay realistic, and take care of your money.